when the freshly peeled, glistening black tiger prawn made contact with the gritty, unforgiving concrete floor. A floor that surely hadn't seen a speck of dirt until this precise moment. The 200 impeccably dressed souls in the gilded banquet hall collectively petrified. 100 wine glasses, crystal orbs reflecting the dim chandelier light, halted their ascent to polished lips. My father-in-law, Preston. His face a mask of purple fury beneath an attempted veneer of aristocratic disdain, jabbed a manicured finger at the fallen crustacean. "Pick it up and eat it, Garrett," he enunciated, his voice laced with the finality of a decree. I felt no flash of anger. The urge to flip the linen-draped table, a brutal impulse that would have satisfied the crude brute they assumed me to be, didn't even register. I merely inclined my body, smoothly retrieving the prawn, now coated in the fine, stale dust of the venue. I did this because, nestled securely inside the inner pocket of my oil-stained, custom-tailored overalls, the only relic of my former life they allowed me to wear, sat a crisp, fresh photocopy. It was the centerpiece of my evening. A federally issued asset freeze order and a meticulously signed felony arrest warrant. The federal agents weren't just deployed. They were already stationed 2 floors below, sipping lukewarm coffee and awaiting my prearranged signal. I held the dust-caked prawn aloft, turning it slightly, examining the grime clinging to its curve as if it were a rare, newly unearthed black diamond. The entire room held its breath, expecting the final, humiliating act, the obedient consumption of the insult. I let a slow, predatory smile spread across my face, casually twirling the prawn to catch the light. I leaned in, my voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper meant only for him. You are absolutely right. This prawn is prohibitively expensive. In fact, it's your last supper. The words hadn't even finished vibrating in the air before I released my grip, letting the filthy offering plummet into Preston's Waterford crystal glass, shattering the surface of his vintage, astronomically priced champagne. The resulting splash sprayed his immaculate white silk shirt, freezing their collective, smug expressions into perfect portraits of shock. Inside, I was shaking, not with rage, but with a silent, profound laughter. That pathetic piece of seafood had carried a hidden price tag, $18 million in recovered assets, plus a 20-year sentence in a maximum security penitentiary. Only 3 months had passed since I was still Garrett the Gullible, the absolute idiot straining every nerve to earn a fractional measure of respect from my wife's contemptuous family. That night, the sky had ripped open over Pennsylvania, unleashing a torrential, blinding downpour. I was standing chest-deep in mud on the shoulder of Interstate 95, directing the movements of a massive excavator, coordinating the emergency repair of a crucial collapsed roadway section. The work was vile, brutally physical, and exhausting, but the $80,000 emergency repair contract was solid, enough to keep my mid-sized construction company operational and payroll covered for another 2 months. I was encased in mud-caked overalls, rainwater sheeting off the brim of my hard hat, the very image of the dependable, true blue-collar worker they pretended to tolerate. Kendra's call came with surgical precision at 9 p.m. The background noise was a symphony of elite socializing. The delicate clinking of crystal glasses and the sharp, meaningless peals of shrill laughter. Her voice, however, held a chilling lack of warmth, adopting the cool, dismissive tone one uses when informing a servant of a chore, or perhaps, when casually discarding trash. She informed me that her father, Preston, was hosting a vital, exclusive dinner at their home. A highly revered business consultant named Julian was allegedly on the verge of announcing a transformative, destiny-altering project for the Holloway dynasty. Like an obedient, pathetic lapdog desperate for a scrap of validation, I immediately shut down the $80,000 contract operation. The money be damned, and drove my heavy-duty pickup, still aggressively plastered with road grime and mud, toward my father-in-law's suburban palace. During the drive, I was mentally running through road apologies, rehearsing how to explain to Kendra yet another delay, and meticulously planning how to apologize to Preston for the inevitable interruption of his precious gathering. Looking back, I realized the crushing depth of my self-abasement. I was adorably, dangerously stupid then, a domesticated pet bounding over with unreserved excitement the second its master whistled. Preston Holloway's grand villa was situated deep within the most obscenely expensive, exclusive community adjoining the Philadelphia suburbs. This sprawling Victorian-style mansion was supposed to be the enduring, tangible symbol of the family's golden glory. Yet I knew the bitter truth. The Holloways had been functionally bankrupt for years, clinging desperately to a shimmering, unsustainable facade of glamour. Every single genuine antique, priceless heirlooms passed down through generations had been systematically sold off, replaced by meticulous, high-quality replicas designed only to fool a casual glance. The famous oil paintings, the ones that held genuine market value, had been leveraged and mortgaged to the bank, with cheap, mass-produced prints now hanging conspicuously in their place. Even those enormous, dazzling crystal chandeliers, which appeared to flood the foyer with luxurious light, were actually inexpensive fakes, carefully sourced and polished after being salvaged from the second-hand market. When I finally appeared at the front door, covered head to toe in a fine layer of damp mud, my mother-in-law, Eleanor, stood waiting. Her expression was perfectly calibrated, like she was staring down at a fresh pile of dog feces polluting her prized, antique Persian rug. She pointed a rigid finger at the work boots on my feet, her voice scraping the air with a high-pitched, abrasive screech, the sound of nails dragging across a chalkboard. She commanded me to leave those filthy things out on the porch. I complied instantly, the habit of obedience ingrained, walking into the immense, silent living room wearing only my pitiful, hole-ridden work socks. The room was dense with guests, all encased in sharp bespoke suits and gleaming leather shoes, and I felt immediately reduced to a grotesque spectacle. A beggar who had tragically wandered into a palace, appearing utterly comical and ridiculously misplaced. Conversation immediately ceased. Every eye in the room pivoted toward me, their gazes filled with the cold, scientific curiosity one reserves for watching a gorilla in a zoo that has just miraculously learned to walk upright. An old woman, draped in diamonds and wearing gold-rimmed glasses, even produced a silk handkerchief to delicately cover her nose, reacting as if I were emitting some deadly, contagious plague. Kendra, my wife, was standing beside Julian, magnificent in a $3,000 haute couture evening gown, looking utterly detached from me. Julian, 38 and painfully self-aware, was immaculate in a bespoke suit, his hair slicked back with expensive oil, his mouth constantly regurgitating a torrent of meaningless business buzzwords. When he caught sight of my muddy appearance, the corner of his perfect mouth twitched into a trace of a contemptuous, almost pitying smile, the kind you'd reserve for a filthy, stray cat that had just crawled miserably out of a dumpster. Preston, visibly straining against the limits of sobriety, raised his heavy crystal whiskey glass, initiating his excruciatingly cliched, rambling speech about the indestructible glory and legacy of the Holloway family name. This 60-year-old man had once been the undisputed heir to the third-largest department store chain in all of Philadelphia, yet their entire retail empire had been annihilated by the unforgiving surge of e-commerce years ago. Now, he was relegated to maintaining his fragile facade of respectability purely by systematically liquidating every last piece of ancestral jewelry and every valuable he owned. He was the perfect metaphor for decay, a rotting apple, desperate to maintain a rosy, flawless exterior even as its interior was thoroughly riddled with holes and worms. Julian then assumed center stage in the living room, launching into his grand, glittering pitch, painting a dazzling, impossible pie-in-the-sky scenario with the fervent charisma of a seasoned pyramid scheme leader. He dramatically unveiled his vision for a massive new commercial hub, grandly titled Riverside One, which, he promised, would not just revive but completely re-engineer the financial destiny of the entire Holloway lineage. His tone was feverishly passionate, his gestures theatrical and exaggerated, like a clumsy actor struggling through a second-rate Broadway play. Whenever he dropped one of his key buzzwords, terms like capital leverage, value restructuring, or industrial empowerment, the assembled guests would dutifully emit synchronized sounds of awe and admiration, reacting as if they had just been granted some profound, apocalyptic financial wisdom. Preston's eyes, glazed over but shining, reflected the projected light of imaginary mountains of gold and silver. He grandly declared that he would immediately mortgage every single remaining family asset to fully fund the initial investment in this magnificent project. Then, his head swiveled toward me, his gaze cold and calculating, precisely like a butcher assessing a fat pig awaiting the slaughter. He informed the assembled elite that the family was supremely fortunate to have a professional construction contractor, namely me, who could guarantee the absolute highest quality building services for the project. Of course, this would be rendered strictly at cost price. This, he concluded, was my glorious opportunity to contribute selflessly to the family's revival. Every guest nodded in solemn, instantaneous agreement, acting as though it were only natural, only correct, for me to donate my highly specialized labor for free. A banker with an unfortunately pronounced mustache even clapped his hands together with cynical enthusiasm, declaring, "This is the modern version of the feudal system, a truly perfect cooperation between lord and serf." The entire room erupted into a symphony of superior, mocking laughter. I stood there, mute, being openly assessed for my chattel value like a true serf. Kendra offered absolutely no defense or support for me. She was fully occupied adjusting Julian's perfectly knotted silk tie, her eyes locked on him with a gaze that felt sticky, like a dense spiderweb spun from lust and adoration. Without even looking at me, she issued an order. "Garrett, go check the ice maker in the kitchen. Preston needs ice for his whiskey, and the machine might be acting up again." I was dismissed and sent staggering away like a kitchen servant. As I left, I could hear their suppressed snickers immediately rise behind me, quickly followed by deliberately amplified comments. Walking toward the back of the house, I clearly heard the banker lean in and say to the person next to him that this scenario perfectly illustrated why noble blood and breeding were fundamentally important. He declared with absolute conviction, "Some people are simply born to do menial work, to follow basic commands, while others are born to rule and to command." Kendra's laughter was the most piercing sound of all. "Although Garrett does manage to make decent money," she chimed in, "he will never ever comprehend true business wisdom," she continued, her voice dripping with scorn. "His brain is exactly like the crude machines he operates, simple, basic, and only running strictly according to the program." When I reached the kitchen and began the pretense of examining the massive commercial ice maker, I inadvertently stumbled upon the deepest secret of this old house. Preston, that pathologically paranoid old fox, had once commissioned the installation of a complex, top-of-the-line smart home surveillance system throughout the entire mansion, primarily out of a deep fear of burglary. Crucially, this system included high-fidelity audio monitoring devices subtly wired into every single room. And, thanks to the fact that I had personally installed all the audiovisual wiring in this house 3 years prior, they hadn't bothered to change the original administrator password. While I appeared to be diligently fixing the ice maker's internal mechanisms, I was actually tuning into the system's dedicated listening feed. Moments later, I was able to access the private, sealed conversation between Kendra and Julian happening live in the study. At that precise moment, the reality of the betrayal hit me like a physical force. I felt my entire world structurally collapse, as if I had been fully run over by a 10-ton excavator I was operating. Kendra's voice filtered through the speaker, crisp and unervingly cheerful. She said, "That big fool will definitely sign the contract tomorrow, Julian. He'll run straight to wherever his master points, just like a well-trained dog." She casually laid out the post-project strategy. Immediately after the construction phase was complete, they would meticulously manufacture a catastrophic engineering failure or an artificial site accident, using it as grounds to sue me for massive breach of contract, ensuring I would be left utterly penniless and burdened with crippling financial debts. Her tone was shockingly light and breezy, as if she were idly discussing tomorrow's weather forecast or tonight's dinner menu selection. Julian let out a low, satisfied laugh, the precise sound of a weasel that had just successfully snatched a chicken, and confirmed that he had drafted the contract to be completely seamless and legally impenetrable. He called this maneuver true financial leverage, using every dollar of my hard-earned capital to fund their glamorous business venture. He pompously added that a simpleton like Garrett, who knew nothing more than how to operate heavy machinery and stack bricks, could never grasp the profound, subtle complexities of modern finance. Then, They smoothly transitioned into discussing their plans for a luxurious Italian vacation. Kendra declared her intention to purchase a small, sun-drenched estate in Tuscany, where they could finally settle down and live the life of genuine European nobility. But the most damning, most venomous part of the discussion followed. If simple financial fraud proved insufficient, they were fully prepared to stage a far more vicious, permanent solution. A seemingly accidental construction site death. Kendra stated chillingly into the recording that if I were to suddenly perish in a workplace accident, she, as the grieving widow, would inherit everything I owned, allowing her to then openly and lavishly join Julian. Julian then began describing, with horrifying professional detail, exactly how to fake a subtle mechanical failure within the hydraulic system so that the accident would occur specifically while I was operating the excavator on a high-risk structural teardown. They even coldly discussed the ideal timing. Julian theorized it would be most profitable to strike when the project was nearing completion, ensuring they had already extracted the maximum amount of construction funds and guaranteeing the accident could be easily attributed to an operational error caused by overwork and exhaustion. Kendra eagerly added that she had already contacted the insurance provider and added a substantial accidental death rider policy for me, the sole beneficiary, naturally, being herself. Listening to the cold, meticulously plotted details of my own execution, I involuntarily collapsed, pressing myself against the slick, cold marble countertop. I could feel the blood retreating from my extremities, congealing in my core. 3 years of marriage, all the whispered tenderness, the comforting late-night presence, the solemn vows of eternal love, were nothing more than a carefully engineered, slow-acting death trap. Kendra had never loved me. She had merely been the patient executioner, waiting for the perfect moment to not only drain every dollar of my hard-earned money but also to extinguish my life. In a state of detached shock, my gaze fell upon Kendra's exquisite designer handbag, carelessly placed on the kitchen table. Driven by a grim necessity, I opened it and found a cache of indisputable evidence. Inside were the preliminary drafts for the divorce asset division, along with the official application to modify the insurance beneficiary. Crucially, on the margins of these documents were Julian's and her own handwritten, calculating notes detailing exactly how much money she stood to gain upon my death. They had calculated everything with forensic precision. The insurance payout, the company equity value, the projected revenue from selling off all my mechanical equipment, and even the paltry resale price of my beat-up heavy-duty pickup truck. What solidified the horror was a separate, single sheet of paper containing a handwritten timeline of their operations. Step 1. Secure my signature on the construction contract. Step 2. Induce me to invest further crucial operational funds. Step 3. Precisely manufacture a fatal construction accident. Step 4. Swiftly handle the funeral arrangements and execute the asset transfer. Every step was assigned a specific cold time node, resembling nothing so much as a flawless clinical business plan for a double murder. I felt no surge of blind rage compelling me to storm into the study like a madman, nor did I impulsively tear up those hateful documents right there. Instead, I stared into my reflection on the polished stainless steel surface of a refrigerator panel. I saw the face covered in highway dust and bone-deep fatigue. I saw the eyes that had once shone with simple, devoted love, now holding nothing but a vast, terrifying emptiness. In that pivotal moment, the foolish, loving Garrett, the man who adored his wife and craved acceptance from her family, died entirely. In his place stood the predator, the hunter, frighteningly composed and razor-sharp. I calmly rearranged the documents, replacing everything exactly as I had found it, and returned to the living room with the ice tray, projecting a simple, honest, somewhat naive smile. I announced my eager acceptance of the Riverside 1 project and expressed my profound willingness to contribute every ounce of my strength to the Halloway family's financial resurrection. Preston and Julian exchanged a swift, triumphant gleam of their eyes. They had confirmed their assumption. I was indeed the brainless laborer, the pliable tool they could easily manipulate. Kendra even exhaled a small, audible sigh of relief. She walked over and patted my shoulder. Her hand was warm, soft, and familiar, but her touch now felt nauseating, exactly like the smooth, cold coil of a venomous snake. But I introduced one single, small condition. I stipulated that while I would serve as the principal construction contractor responsible for all physical labor and execution, I would absolutely not participate in any high-level investment or financial decision-making for the project. Preston was immediately ecstatic upon hearing this, his joy obvious, as it perfectly guaranteed him purely free, exploitable labor without any future obligation to share the massive anticipated profits. Julian nodded repeatedly, a smug expression on his face, agreeing that such a precise division of labor was most reasonable, ensuring professional matters are left strictly to professional people. For the remainder of that agonizing night, I sat rigidly at the table, a perfectly tuned puppet, listening patiently as they continued to spin their lavish, beautiful future. I endured hearing them heap unending praise upon Julian's supposed business genius, and I listened to their nauseating expressions of gratitude and appreciation directed toward me, the humble servant. Every single word was a searing cut across my heart, yet the simple, honest, guileless smile remained pasted firmly on my face. I even took the initiative to ask probing, detailed questions about the project specifications, carefully feigning genuine desire and palpable excitement for participating in this great, shared cause. It was well into the late hours when the final guests began to depart. Kendra walked me to the front door for the staged farewell. She stood on her tiptoes and delivered a light kiss to my cheek, declaring she was very, very happy tonight, and so glad to see that I had finally integrated fully into her family's world. She whispered that she loved me and promised that our future together would only improve. That kiss landed on my skin like a white-hot branding iron, and her sweet words were nothing more than pure, distilled arsenic. Yet, I had to complete the performance, hugging her back tightly, whispering that I loved her too and promising that I would work harder than ever to give her the magnificent life she deserved. My meticulously planned, cold-blooded revenge had officially begun the second I drove away from that porch. The inaugural, critical phase of my plan was to achieve total comprehension of my enemy's operational structure and true situation. I immediately engaged the services of a high-end, discreet private investigation firm, a group known for their ruthlessness and efficiency, specifically tasked with digging into Julian's background and financial footprint. The findings that returned to me were professionally assembled and chillingly direct. This so-called angel investor was, in stark reality, a career professional con artist who specialized in meticulously packaging entirely bogus shell projects specifically designed to fleece money from the affluent middle class and the vulnerable, declining upper class. The investigation report revealed that his real, registered name was Julian Stanson. He had previously been indicted in Chicago on multiple counts of serious financial fraud, only escaping prison due to a technicality involving insufficient tangible evidence. Upon arriving in Philadelphia, he had expertly laundered his identity, adopted a new name, and systematically targeted struggling, declining wealthy families. The Holloway family was merely the latest, most profitable entry on his list of prey. Prior to Preston, he had successfully defrauded at least 3 other families using almost identical methods. Even more critically, the report highlighted Julian's truly desperate financial state. He owed massive, crippling debts to multiple, notorious shadow banks operating within the Philadelphia underworld. These organizations, which lend money at usurious, terrifying interest rates, dispense with collateral checks and credit scores, but their debt collection methods are inhumanly cruel. Once a borrower misses a payment, the consequence isn't merely losing a hand or a foot. It involves torture so complete it makes the victim desperately wish for death. Simultaneously, I uncovered Kendra's carefully constructed secret life. She was not the sophisticated, art-savvy gallery manager she claimed to be. In reality, she operated as a high-priced hostess, codenamed Venus, at an ultra-exclusive, high-end nightclub, specializing in catering to the emotional and physical needs of wealthy, older men. Her supposed romantic meeting with Julian had not been a coincidence or a whirlwind romance. It was a cold, calculated setup deliberately orchestrated by Julian himself. As Venus, her primary function was to systematically extract intimate personal and financial information from high-net-worth customers, data which she then relayed back to Julian for the design and execution of their elaborate fraud schemes. Their organized operation had successfully victimized at least a dozen wealthy families. The standard methodology was always the same. First, deploy Kendra to approach the vulnerable male members of the target family. Then, through marriage or a deeply convincing romantic relationship, she would establish rock-solid trust, culminating in a partnership with Julian to implement the final, devastating scam. I sadly represented their latest and most profitable target to date. The total valuation of my assets, my construction company, all my heavy mechanical equipment, and my patented proprietary technology exceeded $5 million. This sum, they calculated, was more than enough capital for them to retire lavishly and live as their idea of true nobility. In their eyes, I was never a partner or a husband. I was nothing more than a convenient, disposable tool. I spent 3 days locked inside my empty house, systematically digesting the raw, toxic information provided by the investigators. I meticulously re-examined every single detail of my last 3 years of married life. It was a terrifying revelation. Every single smile Kendra had bestowed, every act of demure coquetry, every whispered sweet word, was nothing more than a carefully scripted, relentless performance. She had even meticulously cared for me when I was genuinely ill, comforted me during periods of professional downturn, and celebrated my minor successes with apparent warmth. But all of this was solely to maintain her flawless persona and deepen my blind trust. I began forcefully recalling the minor details I had previously dismissed as loving concern. Kendra had always shown an unusual, almost aggressive interest in the minute details of my work, persistently asking about the company's precise financial status and future business prospects. She had also frequently, almost desperately, suggested that I expand the scale of my business operations and take on larger, higher-risk projects. At the time, I foolishly believed she was concerned about securing our shared future. Now, the context was blindingly clear. She was methodically preparing the terrain for the final catastrophic fraud. Even more detestable was the extent of her infiltration. She had expertly leveraged my absolute trust to extract vast amounts of internal company information. She knew my bank account passwords, had access to my full client roster, and was privy to some of my most guarded trade secrets. If I hadn't uncovered the plot precisely when I did, she could have effortlessly hollowed out the entire infrastructure of my company without me noticing a single sign of distress. 1 week later, Julian contacted me, inviting me for a guided tour of the project site and the temporary headquarters he had ostensibly rented. The office was located within a pathetically dilapidated, third-rate office building in a neglected section of downtown Philadelphia. The rent so suspiciously low it should have been screaming fraud. The walls inside were cheaply adorned with tacky, mass-produced inspirational posters featuring various successful entrepreneurs. His expansive desk was buried under mountains of thick, professionally bound business plans and financial statements, the exact visual architecture designed to mimic a high-capital investment firm, yet clearly constructed only to swindle novice investors. Julian, naturally, was wearing his immaculate, bespoke suit, perpetually spotless, and was engaged in a call that was obviously an elaborate piece of pretentious theater. He was speaking loudly, using exaggerated, expansive gestures into the phone about international projects, strategic cooperation, and global capital operations. His voice was loud enough for every single person in the threadbare office to overhear his alleged importance. When he finally hung up, he proudly informed me that he had just concluded a discussion with a major hedge fund manager who was seriously considering injecting substantial capital into the Riverside 1 project. Internally, I sneered. This was transparent, low-level posturing, worse than the pathetic theatrics of a street-corner pyramid scheme leader. Yet, I maintained my cover, immediately offering an expression of wide-eyed envy and admiration. I told Julian sincerely that it was my distinct honor to work alongside such a business genius, and that I desperately hoped to absorb some true modern business wisdom from him. Hearing this, Julian swelled up with toxic, pure conceit. He immediately launched into a condescending lecture, instructing me on the meaning of capital operation, the intricacies of the leverage effect, and the profound meaning of value restructuring. He covered a whiteboard in complex, meaningless charts, and deployed a heap of obscure financial terminology that I diligently pretended not to understand. He had taken a simple, mundane real estate development project and packaged it so aggressively it sounded like the results of some Nobel Prize-winning economic research. During the lecture, I casually pointed out a large, heavy-duty safe nestled discreetly in the corner, next to several pieces of computer equipment that looked strikingly advanced for a temporary office. I feigned ignorant curiosity, asking him about their precise purpose. Julian puffed out his chest and proudly explained that these were high-end, specialized devices required for complex, delicate financial operations, capable of monitoring global market trends in real time to facilitate precise, moment-by-moment investment decisions. The truth, which I already knew from the investigation, was that this equipment was state-of-the-art gear used exclusively for forging sophisticated documents and efficiently laundering staggering amounts of dirty money. Through these systems, Julian and his co-conspirators could fabricate flawless bank records, generate fake investment reports, and even hack into the legacy systems of small community banks to conduct illegal transactions. This seemingly cultured, bespoke-suited business elite was, in fact, a sophisticated high-tech criminal. Finally, he took me to see the land itself. The property was the sprawling, derelict site of a long-abandoned chemical plant, situated in a depressingly remote, inaccessible location, and secured at a price so ridiculously low it screamed volumes. Any developer with a shred of experience knows the immutable rule. Cheap goods are never good, especially when dealing with the contaminated history of an old chemical plant site. Beneath that seemingly flat, unremarkable land often lay toxic residues, a biological time bomb resulting from decades of unchecked industrial pollution. The three of us, Julian, Kendra, and I, stood on that gray, lifeless wasteland. Julian was as wildly excited as a small child who had just received the most expensive toy, pointing vaguely toward the distant, sluggish river view and pontificating endlessly. He promised that this toxic acreage would somehow be transmogrified into the glorious new commercial center of Philadelphia, generating thousands of desperately needed jobs. He concluded, his voice swelling with false prophecy, that the Holloway family would soon stand triumphantly at the pinnacle of the social pyramid, all thanks to this singular, destiny-defining project. Kendra positioned herself a short distance away, her designer jacket contrasting sharply with the desolate sight. Greed was not just visible, it was practically radiating from her eyes, already calculating the steady, opulent flow of money she envisioned flooding her bank accounts. I deliberately knelt, adopting the posture of a seasoned, contemplative professional, and scooped up a generous handful of the dark, almost unnaturally black soil. The moment it warmed in my palm, the olfactory assault began. A sharp, acrid chemical odor that stung the nostrils. The texture was wrong, too gritty, and the color, under the harsh noon sun, was unmistakably tainted. The telltale sign of heavy metal contamination wasn't just visible. It shimmered. There was an eerie, iridescent rainbow sheen across the surface, mirroring the slick residue of serious oil pollution. Every instinct honed over decades in this industry screamed a warning. This site was a Superfund nightmare waiting to happen. Building anything here, especially a high-rise, was professional suicide, requiring an environmental cleanup operation costing millions before a single foundation pile could be driven. Clutching the noxious handful of earth, I performed my part flawlessly. I dramatically inhaled deeply, simulating a momentary dizziness of professional rapture, and turned to Julian. Julian, can you really smell it? That deep, earthy tang? I paused, leaning in conspiratorially. This isn't just the smell of industry, my friend. This is the sedimentation of history, a foundation forged over generations. This ground is absolutely solid, hard as granite, just as rigid and unshakable as your magnificent business vision. Julian beamed, his face splitting into a wide, self-satisfied smile, completely oblivious that my effusive praise was a sophisticated way of telling him his head was as dense and inert as cured cement. Kendra, draped in an unforgivingly expensive designer coat, stood back several yards, dabbing at her nose with a dainty silk handkerchief. What is that stench, Garrett? It's truly awful. I maintained my neutral, blue-collar facade. That, Kindra, I stated flatly, is the smell of money, pure, unadulterated cash. Once this tower rises, that's all you'll be smelling. She responded with a sharp, delighted giggle, finally lowering the silk mask. She praised me for finally understanding, for catching up to what genuine business acumen entailed. Playing the role of the curious, slightly slow associate, I inquired about the site's history. Julian waved a dismissive hand. Oh, just some small defunct chemical plant years ago. Produced some totally innocuous daily cleaning products. Very clean operation, Garrett. I knew the precise truth. This wasn't some clean operation. This site was historically a major producer of aggressive pesticides and heavy industrial compounds, forcibly shuttered by the EPA in the mid-80s due to catastrophic, localized pollution. Julian's lie was motivated by pure financial impatience. He was desperate to bypass the mandatory, expensive, and time-consuming environmental assessments. Standard testing alone would easily consume hundreds of thousands of dollars and drag the project timeline out by several frustrating months. I seized the opportunity, leaning into my assumed role as the resourceful lackey. I actively proposed a solution. Julian, I have connections in the state environmental department. We can expedite the process, get the necessary sign-offs fast, maybe even secure a substantial discount on the services. The look in Julian's eyes was priceless. He thought he had just leveraged a major advantage. This pompous fool was utterly unaware that the United States possesses the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, better known as Superfund. This draconian federal law strictly dictates that the current landowner, regardless of who caused the damage, assumes full, uncapped financial responsibility for all necessary pollution cleanup. The moment the pollution was discovered, Julian, as the legal owner, would instantly be shackled with tens of millions of dollars in mandatory remediation costs. Crucially, this liability is non-transferable. Even the shield of corporate bankruptcy would offer him no escape. The day of the contract signing required a meticulous costume. I donned a suit that felt alien and restricting, one I usually couldn't stand the stiffness of. A cheap attempt to mimic a nouveau riche trying clumsily to fit into Julian's elevated social circle. To emphasize my common background and alleged lack of sophistication, I made sure my appearance was deliberately rough. I skipped shaving, leaving a shadow of stubble, and didn't bother to trim the grime from beneath my fingernails. Julian, predictably, was waiting in his penthouse office, thick stacks of contracts and ancillary legal documents spread across his oversized mahogany desk. A pungent, expensive Cuban cigar smoldered in an ornate ashtray. He leaned back, the picture of self-importance, and pontificated smugly about teaching me the tenets of modern business cooperation and outlining their mutually beneficial win-win model. I listened patiently, then produced the construction contract I had meticulously crafted months earlier. It was a dense tome, a full 80 pages interwoven with deliberately obtuse technical jargon and highly specific legal provisions. I presented it as the innocuous industry standard contract. To rush the process and capitalize on his vanity, I noted that finalizing the project immediately would be a magnificent gift just before Kindra's birthday banquet. I suggested we skip the tedious and costly lawyer's review. Julian, eager to make a grand splash at the upcoming gala and supremely confident in his ability to control every narrative, immediately consented to bypass the legal oversight. The entire plot hinged on Clause 14, Section B. This lethal provision was cunningly embedded within the attached Environmental Compliance Declaration, obscured by complex, deliberately vague wording designed to look like standard, harmless boilerplate. The clause unequivocally stipulated that Party A, Julian Sterling as the sole owner of the land, accepted full and absolute responsibility for all facets of the project concerning land use change, environmental compliance review, and all related historical liabilities, explicitly including groundwater and soil pollution cleanup. Party B, my company, assumed no joint liability for these issues and was under no obligation whatsoever to conduct relevant environmental testing or disclosure. Julian, the typical greedy amateur, zeroed in only on the large print profit distribution clauses, skimming past all the crucial fine print. I cemented the facade, adopting my most simple, honest, blue-collar expression. We folks who work with our hands don't pretend to understand those complex legal terms, Julian. We just follow what the lawyers tell us are industry rules. I lied smoothly. These are all standard formats, written this way by the firm. Julian merely glanced at the text, signed his name with an overly dramatic flourish, and offered a smug parting shot. Garrett, you're still far too conservative. A true entrepreneur must dare to take calculated risks and break with stale tradition. Kendra, looking utterly out of place in a brand-new, stiff luxury suit, sat nearby, playing the role of the boss lady. Her eyes were glazed with adoration as she watched Julian sign, viewing him as a conquering hero. She even volunteered to countersign the document, suggesting it would add a layer of formality and ceremony. Inside, I recoiled with silent contempt. These two utter fools had just willingly signed their mutual economic death warrants. Kendra's co-signature was the unexpected bonus. It made her jointly and severally liable. If she ever dared to leave Julian, this mountainous, inescapable environmental debt would pursue her for the rest of her life. Following the execution of the contract, Julian insisted on a celebratory feast at the most prohibitively expensive steakhouse in Philadelphia. We were sequestered in a ridiculously ornate private room where he proceeded to order the rarest, priciest Wagyu beef available and uncorked a vintage bottle of the most expensive red wine the cellar boasted. He was full of bombast, detailing his magnificent blueprint. Riverside 1, he declared grandly, was merely the beta test. Next, they would systematically replicate the model across the entire United States, forging an invincible business empire. After a few glasses of the potent Bordeaux, Kendra's fantasies began to spill out, becoming increasingly extravagant. She dreamt aloud of acquiring a minimalist penthouse in Manhattan and a sprawling, glass-fronted seaside villa in California, ensuring that everyone who had ever dismissed or slighted her would finally be forced to acknowledge her status. Then came the truly nauseating part. She declared her intent to establish a philanthropic foundation dedicated specifically to aiding destitute construction workers and improving the living conditions of blue-collar laborers. People, she sweetly noted, just like I used to be. Listening to her utter this appalling hypocrisy, I nearly suffocated on the red wine. The woman's staggering brazenness defied all human comprehension. She was openly detailing plans to use the capital she was actively stealing from my life, money literally squeezed from my sweat and labor, to perform some self-aggrandizing charitable act for people exactly like me, packaging her deceit as noble kindness. My simmering rage tightened into a silent, fierce oath to make her pay dearly for this performance of virtue. What was even more galling was the casual way Kendra continued to allocate my money. Right there in front of me. She rattled off a shopping list. A custom yacht for summer vacations in the Mediterranean, an ancient, moldering castle in Italy, so she could finally live like a true aristocrat. She even planned to hire a private aviation pilot, ensuring she could travel anywhere she pleased without having to look at anyone's grubby face. Julian, fueled by the wine and his own ego, happily participated in this absurd projection. He announced that after this investment succeeded, he would open a boutique private bank exclusively catering to the hyper-rich. He also planned to acquire several key media companies to exert control over public opinion and guarantee their names appeared prominently on every conceivable national wealth list. Hearing this endless stream of narcissistic, delusional nonsense, the fury inside me intensified, burning white-hot. What in God's name did they truly believe I was? A massive, inexhaustible ATM for them to exploit at leisure? A disposable tool to be used and tossed aside when the job was done? They lacked even the most basic capacity for guilt, instead treating the act of defrauding me as a great professional achievement, a victory worthy of this expensive celebration. Driving home that night, Kendra was unervingly affectionate. She nestled close, declaring it the single best day of her life, claiming she finally saw our shared future stretching out before us. She held my arm with the sugary sweetness of a newlywed, and she even played the specific song from our first date on the car stereo. Yet, I recognized this sudden tenderness for what it was, the sheer external overflow of her internal euphoria. She genuinely believed she was on the verge of shedding the rough, oil-stained skin of her construction contractor husband and ascending into the aristocratic life she had always craved. She had already mentally signed the divorce papers and was busy budgeting the spoils. In the days immediately following, Kendra began a frantic, unexplained schedule of frequent outings. She claimed she was scouting additional financing partners for Riverside One. In reality, thanks to the discreet tracking device I had already installed, I knew she was circulating through high-end, exclusive venues, private luncheon clubs, Michelin-starred restaurants, and high-security jewelry boutiques. She was obsessively preparing for her transition into her new, upper-echelon identity, attempting to quickly absorb the esoteric etiquette and lifestyle of the truly wealthy. She started consciously altering her vocal patterns, attempting to mimic the clipped accent and refined diction of the noble ladies she aspired to emulate. Her reading material shifted radically. She acquired expensive, leather-bound volumes on classical art, music theory, and arcane literature, hoping to quickly package a veneer of cultural literacy. She went so far as to hire a personal image consultant, a woman whose entire job was to teach Kendra how to stand, sit, and speak more elegantly and tastefully in exclusive social situations. Watching her elaborate, often clumsy performances, I felt a potent mixture of anger and biting amusement. Did she truly believe that by simply swapping out her wardrobe for designer labels and reciting a few sophisticated foreign phrases, she could genuinely transform herself into a member of legitimate high society? What she utterly failed to grasp was that genuine aristocratic temperament is an inherent quality, an inner light. It is something that cannot be fabricated through mere external decoration. The day construction officially commenced was marked by a stench. As I lowered the massive steel bucket of my excavator and clawed up the very first shovel load of earth, the site instantly filled with the same suffocating, sharp chemical odor. That dark, heavy soil, now exposed to the unfiltered sunlight, possessed an eerie, oily luster, truly resembling the toxic excrement of some buried demon. Onlookers and adjacent workers recoiled immediately, clamping hands over their noses and retreating several steps. Every experienced foreman and master craftsman knew instantly upon sniffing the air that the ground was severely compromised. Several earnestly suggested I immediately halt operations pending mandated environmental testing. But Julian, arriving in an impeccably pressed suit, was positively giddy, vibrating with the excitement of a small child on Christmas morning. He laughed off the concerns, declaring that the smell was a sign of wealth, arguing that true treasure was always hidden in the most unassuming places. He even pulled out his premium smartphone to document the moment, announcing he needed to record this historic moment, this great beginning, that would fundamentally change the destiny of the Holloway family fortune. Kendra arrived shortly thereafter, ridiculously overdressed in an expensive ensemble and a pair of utterly impractical high heels. She strode onto the site, determined to project her authority as the newly appointed project supervisor. She remained blissfully ignorant of the sheer volume of concentrated toxins hidden beneath that deceivingly flat black surface. She deliberately stepped onto the contaminated earth, striking several haughty poses for her paid assistant to photograph, intending to immediately post the evidence of her career achievements on her social media accounts. I watched her impossibly slender heels sink slightly into the polluted topsoil and realized the poetic justice. Darling, I thought, a cold smile touching my lips, you are quite literally standing on the entrance to your own grave, and you're still actively digging it deeper. With every arrogant step, her luxurious leather heels kicked up plumes of fine dust, tiny particles saturated with heavy metals. These invisible toxins would cling to her expensive fabrics, follow her home, and slowly, insidiously permeate every corner of her sanitized life. Julian became a constant, unwelcome fixture. He visited the site every single day, ready to parade around and issue ill-informed orders, always wearing a suit that remained impossibly spotless against the construction grit. He spent most of his time pointing haphazardly at the massive excavators and bulldozers, behaving exactly like a sheltered hick who had never encountered genuine machinery before. He regularly demanded that I stop work and explain the detailed operating principles of the various machines, as if demonstrating a sudden, aggressive interest in hydraulics and diesel engines would magically prove his professional literacy and learning ability. Whenever the seasoned workers saw him posturing, they would stop just long enough to exchange snickering glances. Yet, I always played my part, cooperating seriously, explaining the function of every lever and every button with excruciating detail. The absolute apex of his vanity was his insistent demand that we erect a colossal billboard at the edge of the construction boundary. It proudly proclaimed, "Riverside 1, created by Julian Sterling," complete with a massive, dramatically lit headshot of him, attempting to look simultaneously profound and visionary. This supremely vain fool had zero concept that this sign, this towering monument to his own ego, would eventually serve as one of the most crucial, undeniable pieces of evidence when the federal prosecutor sought to indict him, clearly proving he was the sole, publicly acknowledged person responsible for this contaminated nightmare. Precisely in the third week of digging, I deliberately orchestrated a minor, yet critical equipment failure, a seemingly authentic hydraulic malfunction that necessitated a 2-day shutdown for specialized repairs. I utilized those crucial 48 hours to secretly extract extensive soil samples from multiple, deep excavation points across the site. I then discreetly forwarded these samples to an independent, accredited environmental testing agency hundreds of miles away for analysis. When the final report arrived, its findings were far more catastrophic than even my professional instincts had anticipated. The concentration of toxic heavy metal pollutants in this land did not merely exceed the environmental standard. It surpassed the maximum allowable limits by an astronomical 1,200 times. The mandated remediation, the complete Superfund cleanup of the site and the surrounding water table, would conservatively cost a minimum of $18 million. I secured this definitive report within a heavy-duty safe, treating it like the precious key to their destruction. A fully loaded, ticking time bomb, waiting for the precise moment to detonate. Simultaneously, I intensified my efforts to gather other, equally damning forms of evidence. I had installed a sophisticated dash cam, equipped with deep cloud storage capabilities, into Kendra's car. This device soon began accidentally recording multiple lengthy, chilling conversations between her and Julian while they drove. In these detailed recordings, they discussed with remarkable calmness exactly how they planned to frame me, how they would systematically divide my assets, and even the contingency plans for handling my construction company after my inevitable removal. Kendra's voice was sickeningly casual as she explained that if I met a sudden, tragic end in a construction site accident, she, as the grieving widow, would legally inherit everything, freeing her to publicly unite with Julian. Julian refined the plot, suggesting they should manufacture a highly credible mechanical failure to ensure I was crushed beneath the weight of my own excavator. A solution, he noted, that would resolve the problem permanently without arousing any external suspicion. They even debated the optimal timing. Julian reasoned it would be most profitable to strike when the project was nearing substantial completion. That way, they would secure the vast majority of my committed construction funds, and the subsequent accident could easily be dismissed as an operational error caused by my alleged overwork. Kendra added a horrific detail. She had already initiated contact with the insurance broker to substantially increase my accidental death policy, naming herself, naturally, as the sole beneficiary. What angered me even more was their discussion of my funeral arrangements. Kendra spoke of wearing expensive black mourning attire and performing a masterful role as the heartbroken widow at the service, aiming to garner maximum public sympathy. She even practiced her crying expressions on tape, striving to make her tears appear entirely authentic. Julian confirmed he would attend as the supportive business partner, ostensibly helping Kendra manage the emotional fallout while conveniently taking over the management of my profitable company. Listening back to these audio files, a cold, unprecedented surge of fury flooded my veins. The woman I had once loved with absolute devotion was discussing my execution with the same nonchalance one reserves for debating the evening's dinner menu. She was actively imitating her anticipated funeral wails right into the microphone, rehearsing the perfect portrayal of a bereaved wife. But that paralyzing anger quickly transmuted into a focused, calm determination for comprehensive retribution. I wanted them to pay a price that transcended mere economics. I craved a total mental and emotional breakdown. I needed them to viscerally experience the sensation of falling from the apex of heaven into the deepest, most inescapable hell, forcing them to understand the true meaning of despair. Barely halfway through the project timeline, Julian's inherent character began to fully manifest. Under the pressure of anticipated cash flows and mounting costs, he swiftly reverted to desperate corner-cutting tactics. Working behind my back, he bribed the material procurement manager to systematically swap out the mandated, high-specification structural steel required for the load-bearing columns with cheap, unauthorized substandard products. This inferior steel possessed barely half the necessary seismic capacity of the approved materials. Employing it to build a multi-story high-rise was not just poor contracting. It was a deadly gamble with hundreds of future lives. If this material were actually incorporated into the tower, let alone an earthquake, even a strong wind might risk a structural collapse. As an experienced professional, I recognized the wrong rebar grade instantly. The substandard steel had been superficially coated with convincing but fake certification stamps, yet the underlying structure was demonstrably weak, the textbook definition of putting an expensive facade on a tofu dreg project. I did not involve the authorities immediately. Instead, I executed a controlled tactical response. I issued a direct order for an immediate, total work stoppage, secured the main construction site gate with heavy chains, and posted a large notice at the entrance clearly citing the suspension due to severe owner violations of safety and material specifications. Julian's reaction was immediate and predictable. He called my phone, his voice tight with panic, screeching that this was a fundamental breach of contract and that he would hold me personally and legally responsible, threatening to sue me into destitution to compensate for all perceived losses. I played the role of the beleaguered, safety-conscious contractor. I feigned immense grievance over the phone, explaining that I was merely following stringent safety regulations and simply dared not utilize substandard materials that could potentially harm the public or my own crew. That very afternoon, Julian stormed onto the site, flanked by several intimidating men in cheap black suits. These were not genuine legal advisors. They were low-grade muscle, the kind of third-rate thugs Julian usually hired to intimidate small businesses. Common gangsters accustomed to shaking down bar owners and collecting protection money. They believed they were tough, but facing the raw, uncompromising power of industrial machinery, they were as fragile as cheap tissue paper. I had already positioned myself high in the cab of a heavy-duty hydraulic breaker, a machine that weighed 30 crushing tons, whose massive steel arm could effortlessly obliterate any obstacle in its path. Julian stood below me, screaming into the dust, demanding immediate resumption of work or face severe legal repercussions. His hired subordinates chimed in with predictable tough guy rhetoric, shouting that if I didn't cooperate, they would make me pay. I refused to descend to their level for a verbal spat, nor did I waste a single breath explaining my actions. Instead, I fired up the breaker's engine. The colossal mechanical arm slowly lifted, the grating sound of metal friction echoing across the silent site like the territorial roar of a primal behemoth. Then I deliberately aimed the massive steel spike at a concrete block situated mere inches from the rear bumper of Julian's ridiculously expensive rented sports car, and brought the hammer down with deafening force. The concrete vaporized instantly in a shocking explosion, scattering shards of rock everywhere. The immense shockwave generated by the impact made the entire construction site tremble violently. A large, fist-sized piece of shrapnel landed precisely 10 centimeters from Julian's polished Oxfords, covering his entire lower body in fine, gray dust. The sheer, terrifying volume of the noise left everyone's ears ringing painfully. The men in black went instantly pale. Two of them completely lost control and collapsed into a terrified heap on the ground. I calmly opened the reinforced cab window, slowly lit a cigarette, and addressed them in the quietest, most controlled tone I could muster. Gentlemen, this is an active construction site. Per OSHA regulations, unauthorized personnel enter at their own risk. I am operating heavy machinery. For the next hammer strike, my hand might just slip. Confronted by the colossal, oily steel monster and the sheer violence of its power, Julian's legs instantly failed him. He attempted to maintain his dignity, but his body betrayed him, trembling uncontrollably. His legal advisors had long since melted away into the distance. The thugs, aggressive moments before, now scattered faster than frightened rabbits. The most comical element was Julian's attempt to preserve his gentlemanly facade even in panicked flight. He stumbled while furiously trying to straighten his tie, which fear had knocked askew, muttering weakly that my actions were barbaric and not conforming to business rules. He tried desperately to leave with some semblance of composure, but his foot slipped on the dust and he nearly fell headlong right next to his own leased vehicle. Watching his wretched, retreating figure, I roared with laughter inside the cab. This was the so-called business elite. When confronted with actual, physical power, they couldn't even manage a whimper. They were conditioned to play sterile numbers games in climate-controlled office buildings, used to cloaking their intrinsic weakness in expensive suits and leather shoes. But when faced with the unvarnished reality of the industrial world, they were less than insects. Though the confrontation had utterly terrified Julian, it simultaneously ignited an even stronger, more vicious desire for revenge in his shallow heart. He immediately began secret plotting, reaching out to some shady underworld contacts he maintained, planning to hire them to professionally deal with me. However, the moment these unsavory characters learned they were expected to tangle with a well-equipped construction contractor who owned 30-ton hydraulic breakers and a fleet of heavy machinery, they unanimously declined the job. Realizing I was far more resilient and dangerous than they anticipated, Kendra and Julian pivoted their strategy. They would simply cut me out and go directly for the capital. They desperately scoured for alternative financing and eventually located the most predatory shadow banking organization operating in the darkest corners of Philadelphia. These operators specialized in high-interest loan sharking. They demanded no credit checks and zero collateral, but their interest rates were terrifyingly astronomical, and their collection methods were notoriously savage. Worse yet, to secure the massive injection of cash they needed, Julian brazenly forged my legal signature as a personal guarantor on the loan documents. The idiot genuinely believed that a roughneck like me wouldn't bother monitoring sophisticated bank records. He was dangerously mistaken. My lawyer friend had been meticulously monitoring all related financial activities for months. Any document bearing my name, any attempt to misuse my identity, was immediately flagged and trapped within our net. When this confirmation arrived, I had to stifle a laugh of utter satisfaction. Julian, in his perceived cleverness, had just committed a federal felony. Forging another person's signature for purposes of financial fraud is one of the most serious crimes in the U.S., carrying a mandatory sentence of more than 10 years, and it guaranteed a non-negotiable federal indictment. I withheld the police report. I needed this financial catastrophe to be the ultimate crushing weight. The interest on these loan shark debts was calculated daily, accumulating exponentially. For every single day the project stalled, the principal would balloon larger and larger. Furthermore, this specific type of high-interest debt cannot be discharged through bankruptcy. It follows the debtor for life. To ensure maximum exposure, and even better, to maintain the appearance that he retained some repayment ability, Julian had also coerced Kendra into becoming a joint guarantor. Kendra signed without reading, assuming it was just a regular, inconsequential business formality. She had absolutely no idea that she had just signed a unilateral, non-refundable ticket straight to financial ruin. Kendra remained tragically clueless about the depth of the hole her beloved lover had just dug. For her, she was still fantastically absorbed in the delusion of using this money, which she believed was imminent, to buy a sprawling mansion in the sun-drenched hills of Tuscany and finally live the gilded, leisurely existence of a European noble lady. Her preparations were thorough and absurdly premature. She had begun studying rudimentary Italian, practicing phrases meant for servants, and had purchased an overwhelming stack of glossy fashion magazines, obsessively cataloging the aesthetics and perceived etiquette of the upper echelon. A massive, high-resolution photograph of an 18th-century Tuscan estate was meticulously taped above her bed. She stared at its stone facade and cypress trees every night before sleep, visually rehearsing the scene. Herself gliding through a private vineyard, the fabric of a magnificent long dress whispering against the ancient soil. Meanwhile, my own meticulous planning continued. To make the retribution absolute, I enacted the next phase of the layout. Leveraging a trusted contact, I reached out to the FBI's highly specialized Environmental Crimes Division. I filed an anonymous, yet highly detailed, report regarding the land contamination catastrophe at the Riverside 1 project. Crucially, I supplied the agents with the verified granular soil test results and the original construction contracts, providing irrefutable proof that Julian was fully aware of the toxicity and had deliberately and criminally concealed the environmental hazard for profit. The FBI moved swiftly, initiating a covert investigation. They immediately subpoenaed Julian's bank records, which led them straight to the $5 million loan secured with the fraudulent signature. Using advanced technical surveillance, they also obtained a complete record of communications between Julian and Kendra, compiling evidence of their intricate conspiracy, which spanned from financial fraud all the way to a premeditated plot to murder me. I worked closely with the agents, supplementing their findings with the arsenal of proof I had collected, including the exhaustive audio files I'd recorded over months and the critical in-car recordings from Kendra's vehicle. When the agents listened to Kendra coolly discussing how to disguise my murder as a routine construction accident, speculating on the exact height and weight of the machinery needed, the atmosphere in the room shifted palpably. Their expressions hardened. This was no longer just a nuanced white-collar commercial fraud case. It had escalated instantly into a major criminal case involving felony conspiracy to commit murder. The agents explained that they needed an ironclad guarantee of conviction, requiring even more undeniable proof, ideally, evidence secured in the act. They suggested I maintain my cooperation and, at the strategically correct moment, execute a carefully orchestrated sting to lure the snake out of its hole. I readily agreed, proposing a final net-closing operation to take place at Kendra's upcoming birthday banquet. This plan demanded absolute, clockwork precision. The FBI teams would position themselves covertly near the site 2 hours before the event was scheduled to start, awaiting my single, nonverbal signal. My role was to expose the truth publicly, driving Julian and Kendra to fully and unequivocally reveal their criminal intent and actions so they could be apprehended red-handed, ensuring a successful, unavoidable prosecution. To heighten the dramatic stakes, I also prepared a special, venomous surprise. I contacted several major media outlets, the network affiliates, the city's largest newspapers, and key investigative reporters, anonymously hinting that breaking news of seismic proportions would erupt that evening. These reporters, scenting scandal, were instructed to wait just outside the perimeter of the banquet hall. Once the federal arrests commenced, they would be perfectly positioned to report the explosive scandal that would undoubtedly rock Philadelphia's high society to its core. Kendra's 33rd birthday was fast approaching, and Preston, desperate to resurrect the ghost of the Holloway family name, insisted on hosting the most lavish banquet imaginable on the unfinished top floor of the building. This vain, aging man saw the party as his final grand performance, a chance to display the Holloway family's supposed revival to the entire Philadelphia elite. He invited 200 of the city's so-called celebrities, powerful bankers, influential lawyers, cynical politicians, and other minor aristocrats whose fortunes had long since faded. Preston spared no expense, investing a colossal sum in the decor alone. He spent over $100,000 renting the most opulent tableware, exotic flowers, and vintage champagne, transforming the stark, concrete top floor into a temporary banquet hall fit for an old-world palace. He even engaged the most celebrated catering company in Philadelphia, commissioning a multi-course seafood feast valued at tens of thousands of dollars. The profound irony was almost suffocating. They were celebrating supposed success and renewal inside a rotting building constructed on a bedrock of toxic soil. The sight of that exquisite food arranged inside a structure built on poisoned land was nothing short of macabre, like hosting a frivolous carnival directly on a family grave. Guests, draped in expensive, custom-made gowns and suits, walked across floors that might harbor carcinogens, breathing the close, polluted air, believing themselves to be participating in an elegant, sophisticated social event. Kendra had dedicated an entire month to preparing for this zenith moment. She commissioned a champagne-colored, floor-length gown worth $50,000, a garment encrusted with thousands of imported artificial crystals that promised to sparkle with blinding intensity under the spotlights. She secured the most expensive makeup artist and hair stylist in Philadelphia, determined to be the dazzling, singular focal point of the evening. She even ordered a pair of flawless diamond earrings valued at $100,000, declaring them a birthday gift to herself, a necessary symbol of her transcendent, new identity. She confided to her circle that, starting tonight, she was shedding the skin of a mere construction worker's wife to become a successful businesswoman, a legitimate member of the highest society. Julian, equally desperate for validation, also poured vast resources into this final act. He leased a white stretch limousine, ordered a bespoke, custom-tailored suit, and purchased a high-end luxury watch also valued at $100,000. This debt-ridden swindler was intent on milking every last drop of vanity from this climactic moment, determined to prove to everyone present that he was a business titan. He even prepared a glossy, detailed business plan, intending to formally announce the next nationwide expansion of the Riverside 1 project during the speeches. He planned to convince everyone that this Philadelphia venture was merely the modest start of his burgeoning empire, a model he would soon replicate across the entire U.S. When the engraved invitation arrived at my modest address, I nearly burst into laughter. It was crafted from incredibly expensive, handmade paper, featuring elegant gold-stamped lettering, unquestionably high class. But the title designated for me revealed the deep, structural contempt they held, Mr. Garrett Vance, followed by a single line of small, almost hidden print, construction contractor. The title felt less like an honorific and more like the condescending introduction of a servant allowed into the parlor as an act of calculated charity. On the night of the banquet, I donned the black suit I usually couldn't bear to wear. I had purchased it years ago for my wedding, and in 3 years, I had worn it only twice. Deliberately, I refrained from shaving or trimming my fingernails, letting myself look precisely like the blue-collar worker attempting to infiltrate high society, the jarring anomaly they expected. When I arrived at the top floor, the sheer theatricality of the scene was stunning. The space was gorgeously, almost blindingly, decorated. Heavy crystal chandeliers, rented for the night, hung from the temporary ceiling supports. White orchids, impossibly delicate and expensive, filled every available corner, and a massive champagne tower sparkled under the focused spotlights. The huge, newly installed floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, breathtaking view of downtown Philadelphia. The cityscape, glittering below, was mesmerizing. Guests in their flawless gowns and tuxedos conversed with practiced elegance. Champagne flutes held precisely at chest level. Every person looked glamorous, successful, and perfectly decent. A gathering pulled straight from a Hollywood film detailing aristocratic perfection. Preston, wearing his rented tuxedo and sporting the Holloway family crest pinned conspicuously to his chest, truly looked the part of a restored nobleman. His face flushed with theatrical excitement, he drifted through the crowd, introducing this unprecedented commercial project to every guest, acting as if he was personally on the cusp of recreating the Holloway family's storied golden age. Kendra was the magnetic, absolute focus of the entire event. Swathed in that custom champagne gown, dripping with borrowed jewels, she was radiant with a predatory glow. The $100,000 diamond earrings flashed with dazzling, high-wattage light beneath the lamps, resembling two small, fiercely bright suns hanging beside her ears. Everyone was competing to praise her beauty and her supposed business acumen. She devoured the feeling of being the undisputed center of the universe, her face alight with the smug, arrogant pride of a self-declared victor. Julian stood proprietarily beside her, the bespoke suit fitting him like a second skin, the expensive watch flashing under the lights. One hand rested lightly, possessively, on Kendra's waist, the other holding his champagne glass. He spoke non-stop to the guests about the grand, visionary blueprint of Riverside 1. His voice thick with the unmistakable smugness and hubris of a conqueror celebrating a premature victory. And then there was me. I stood awkwardly at the periphery, a visible, unwelcome anomaly. Though I wore a suit, I still carried the ineradicable scent of engine oil and construction dust, the perfume of honest labor, which was utterly foreign to the antiseptic luxury around me. The other guests glanced at me with expressions ranging from intense curiosity to undisguised contempt, as if observing a poorly dressed farmer who had accidentally wandered into a royal court. Some visibly recoiled, deliberately stepping away as if I carried some kind of low-class contagion. A wealthy matron, burdened with excessive jewelry, pointed discreetly at me and whispered to her companion, "Look over there. That's Kendra's husband, the contractor." I genuinely can't fathom what Kendra ever saw in that kind of person back then, but thank God. She's finally extricating herself from that utterly low-s life. Their subsequent laughter was high-pitched, sharp, and piercing, squawking like two carrion crows circling a carcass. Before the elaborate dinner formally began, there was a short segment reserved for speeches. Preston took the stage first, raising his champagne glass, his hand trembling slightly with emotion. He announced in a reedy voice that tonight marked not only Kendra's birthday but the glorious beginning of the Holloway family's inevitable resurgence. He profusely thanked all the friends present for bearing witness to this historic moment, and extended his deepest gratitude to Julian for bringing this incredible hope back to their fractured family. Then Julian took the microphone. His voice was robust, full of utterly counterfeit passion and misplaced confidence. He proclaimed that the Riverside One project represented the perfect convergence of tradition and modernity, a flawless fusion of aristocratic spirit and sharp business wisdom. He boasted that this project would create thousands of necessary jobs and contribute a monumental amount to the economic revitalization of Philadelphia. Thunderous applause erupted, sweeping through the audience. Everyone seemed genuinely moved by his sheer audacity. Finally, Kendra stepped forward. Her manufactured beauty momentarily silenced the entire room. She offered effusive thanks to everyone for attending, to her family for their unwavering support, and specifically to Julian for his guiding partnership. She declared that tonight was the most beautiful night of her entire life, a moment when she could definitively cast aside the gloom and burdens of the past and embrace a radiant, limitless future. As she delivered this line, her eyes scanned the crowd, finally locking onto me. There was no warmth in her stare, only the raw, exhilarating excitement of imminent release. She was implicitly broadcasting to everyone in the room that she was about to dispose of me, this tiresome burden, and finally begin the life she felt she deserved. At the highest point of the banquet, Preston insisted on conducting a special thank you ceremony directed toward me, the construction contractor. He had the waiters dramatically bring out an exquisite, glistening seafood platter. The black tiger prawns, massive king crabs, and fresh oysters looked impossibly fresh and tempting, each item clearly worth a substantial fortune. Preston theatrically picked up a single, perfectly peeled black tiger prawn from the silver serving dish. This prawn was the size of my palm, crystal clear and glowing under the light, easily worth at least $50. He held the prawn aloft, announcing loudly to all the guests, "This, my friends, is a special reward for our exceptionally hard-working construction contractor." He paused, his eyes drilling into mine, thanking him for his invaluable contribution to the Holloway family and the Riverside One project. The eyes of the entire, silent room snapped into focus on me. Some watched with intense curiosity, some with smug contempt, and others with thinly veiled mockery. I felt exactly like an animal in a circus ring, utterly surrounded, waiting for the crowd's commanded performance. As the story already detailed, when Preston deliberately dropped that massive prawn onto the pristine white floor and issued his final, humiliating command that I should pick it up and eat it, I did not submit to their expectation. That prawn, a tiny piece of seafood that represented $18 million in looming liabilities, ultimately landed with a soft, decisive splash in his champagne glass. Ignoring the splash and the expanding wine stain blooming across Preston's shirt, I calmly took the microphone from the stunned MC and walked directly to the center of the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, good evening." My voice, amplified by the high-end sound system, resonated through every corner of the vast banquet hall. Today is Kendra's birthday and also the death day of this building. A sudden, nervous commotion started rippling through the audience. Kendra's brow furrowed in confused annoyance. Julian's face instantly began to turn pale and slick with sweat. Preston, still forcing a sickly smile, couldn't hide the raw unease flashing in his eyes. Some guests began whispering, unable to comprehend the meaning of a death day. I reached into my pocket, withdrawing a small remote control, and pressed the first button. The massive projection screen at the back of the banquet hall immediately lit up, displaying a document with a stark, red header. It was an emergency inspection report issued minutes ago by the Federal Environmental Protection Agency, EPA. This is the official soil environmental inspection report, just issued by the EPA this afternoon. My voice was terrifyingly calm, as if I were simply reading a dry weather forecast. The heavy metal pollution in the groundwater beneath this land exceeds acceptable federal standards by 1,200 times. This includes dangerously high concentrations of multiple carcinogens, including mercury, lead, and cadmium. I paused for the information to sink in. According to the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, the landowner is required to immediately assume cleanup responsibility. The current estimated cost for full remediation is $18 million. The entire room dissolved into absolute silence. Julian's face was now ghost white, his jaw slack. Kendra's hands began to tremble uncontrollably, the expensive champagne glass nearly slipping from her grasp. Preston's mouth fell open as if he were about to issue a furious command, but no sound could escape. I pressed the second button on the remote. The screen changed, now displaying detailed bank loan records juxtaposed with a forensic handwriting analysis report. Regarding that $5 million high-interest loan, I continued, my voice gaining authority, I regret to inform you that I have just submitted the complete chain of evidence to the FBI, including the full handwriting analysis report and corroborating surveillance footage. Forging another person's signature for financial fraud is a federal felony in the United States, carrying a minimum sentence of 10 years without eligibility for bail. Julian abruptly tried to bolt toward the back door, but he instantly found his path blocked by two large, imposing men wearing my company's work clothes. They stood silently, arms crossed, staring at him with cold, impassive eyes. Although the door was not physically locked, his weak legs couldn't manage a single step forward. He looked around wildly and realized that my workers, my honest, blue-collar crew, were strategically positioned, scattered but vigilant in every corner of the hall. Though they weren't actively blocking any exits, their quiet, powerful presence filled the opulent space with a heavy sense of inescapable oppression. I pressed the third button. The screen displayed a transcript of the audio recording of Kendra and Julian conspiring in the car. Beneath the text was a small photo of the gift. I held up the actual recording device in my hand. This is the recording of the two of you in the car, discussing precisely how to stage a construction accident to ensure my death, I said, addressing Kendra directly. Kendra, do you remember that specific sentence you used? Let him be crushed by his own excavator so you can inherit everything. Kendra finally snapped, comprehending the utter totality of her ruin. She lunged toward me, hysterical, weeping violently, attempting to grab my lapel and beg for some impossible mercy. I gently pushed her away, using only enough force to move a bothersome insect. Her meticulously styled hair instantly became messy. Her expensive gown was quickly soaked with tears, and her flawless makeup smeared, transforming her into a raving, tragic figure. Preston, witnessing the collapse of his family's fabricated empire, tried desperately to speak, but before a single word could escape, he suddenly collapsed onto the floor. This old man, who spent his life projecting aristocratic airs, proved to be more fragile than paper in the face of true, irreversible crisis. He clutched desperately at his chest, his face turning an alarming shade of blue. A clear, immediate heart attack. Eleanor screamed, rushing over to support him, but she was so terrified and weak that her legs buckled, and she could barely stand herself. The guests below finally gave way to full panic. Some made tentative moves to leave, but seeing my workers observing them with the fixed intensity of tigers, they dared not make any rash move. Several guests tried desperately to use their phones to call the police, only to find the network completely paralyzed. The massive projection screen playing high-definition video was intentionally hogging all available bandwidth. The entire opulent banquet hall had transformed into a sealed courtroom, and in that moment, I was the only judge. I looked down at my wristwatch and began a slow, deliberate countdown. 3, 2, 1. As the final word fell, the elevator doors of the banquet hall burst open. A team of federal agents rushed out. They were wearing heavy body armor, fully armed, and moving with the decisive tactical urgency reserved for capturing high-value terrorists. These dramatic scenes, usually confined to television dramas, were now playing out in terrifying reality within this luxurious setting. Julian Sterling, you are under arrest. The lead agent read the arrest warrant, his voice calm, steady, and utterly authoritative. Charges include forgery, financial fraud, environmental crimes, and conspiracy to commit fraud. As Julian was placed into handcuffs, he was still pathetically muttering that this entire spectacle did not conform to business ethics, that it was barbaric behavior. This fool, I thought, would die without ever grasping the fundamental truth. True business is founded on contract, trust, and responsibility, not his flimsy packaging tricks and empty bluster. Kendra Vance, you are also under arrest. Another agent stepped forward and read the second warrant. Charges include conspiracy to commit fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and financial crimes. She stood in that $50,000 gown, now handcuffed, resembling nothing so much as a truly fallen princess. Those expensive diamond earrings still glittered beside her ears, but now they looked like mocking, frozen tears. Preston was rushed to the hospital via ambulance, but the prognosis was grim. Years of untreated high blood pressure combined with the colossal shock of that night meant his compromised heart would likely never withstand pressure again. Eleanor departed with the ambulance. She was still wearing her elaborate evening gown, but her face was a terrifying mask of naked despair and crippling fear. The remaining so-called high society guests scattered like a flock of panicked birds. The noble ladies who had been laughing and gossiping moments ago now cared only about fleeing this tainted place of scandal as fast as possible, terrified of having their names dragged into the coming media storm. The usually sanctimonious businessmen paled, visibly worried that their brief appearance at the event would earn them a mention in tomorrow's headlines. The entire luxurious banquet hall quickly turned into a bustling crime scene. FBI technicians began their systematic work, collecting physical evidence, taking forensic photographs, and sampling the environment. Those expensive decorations and exquisite, untouched foods now seemed to have changed their flavor, looking like the decaying wreckage of a horrible nightmare. I stood exactly in the center of the now emptying hall, watching this meticulously staged grand play that I had directed finally reach its perfect conclusion. 3 years of grinding humiliation, 3 years of deep, corrosive deception were finally, completely settled tonight. That prawn, coated in dust and soaked in spilled wine, still rested silently in Preston's discarded champagne glass. But now, it possessed a strange, post-revenge beauty. 6 months later, the major media outlets in Philadelphia were still reporting details of the sensational commercial fraud and murder conspiracy case. Julian was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Beyond the financial fraud, he was made to bear full civil liability for the environmental pollution. That staggering $18 million cleanup cost would haunt him for the rest of his life, a debt he could never fully repay. Kendra was sentenced to 8 years. The charges primarily revolved around conspiracy to commit fraud and conspiracy to commit murder. Inside the women's correctional facility, she was assigned to work in the laundry room, tasked with washing and folding hundreds of coarse prison uniforms every day. Her hands, once soft and manicured, became scarred and calloused from the corrosive effects of industrial-strength laundry detergent. That woman, who had once squandered money and disdained all forms of manual labor, finally learned the inescapable meaning of true work. Preston did not survive the shock of that night. Complications arising from the massive heart attack caused him to leave this world forever. The very last remnants of the Holloway family legacy were immediately liquidated to pay off mounting debts, and the cherished Victorian mansion was swiftly repossessed and auctioned by the bank. The glory, real or imagined, of the entire family name completely vanished into history. Eleanor now lives in a cheap, drab government-provided apartment, surviving on meager social security benefits. I ran into her once at a large supermarket. This former noble lady now looked like any other exhausted old woman, carrying plastic bags and meticulously sifting through expired food items in the discount section. When she saw me, a flicker of pure, animalistic fear flashed in her eyes, and she instantly turned her head, rushing down a different aisle to escape. And I became the undisputed biggest winner of the entire farce. The media reported the heroic, detailed story of the brave contractor who had dared to expose deep-seated environmental crimes, and consequently, my construction company received more high-profile government projects than ever before. People started looking at me differently, beginning to truly respect those who genuinely do the labor rather than the empty liars who only know how to brag and deceive. That polluted tract of land underwent over a year of meticulous remediation and ultimately became the safest, most environmentally sound construction site in all of Philadelphia. I constructed a real, lasting commercial center there, not for quick profiteering, but as a tangible proof of what true architecture and honest building integrity mean. This new structure used the highest grade materials and adhered to the most stringent environmental standards. Every rebar and every beam could withstand any inspection. On the day of the opening, I did not hold a lavish, showy celebration, nor did I invite any self-important celebrities. I invited only the workers who had participated faithfully in the actual construction to have a simple, genuine dinner in the humble site cafeteria downstairs. There was no imported champagne, only cold beer. No black tiger prawns, only hot fried chicken and crispy French fries. Yet, every face in that room was brimming with true satisfaction and legitimate pride. I returned completely to the life I loved best. Waking up at 5 every morning, walking the site, directing my crews, finding the profound, tangible joy of construction amidst the mud and the steel. My hands grew thick calluses again, and my clothes once more carried that beloved, ineradicable scent of engine oil. But I felt an unprecedented sense of relaxation and freedom. Kendra was right, in a way. I am indeed an ATM covered in stinky sweat. But what she fatally failed to understand is that this particular ATM serves only those who are worthy, and those parasites who demand to reap without sowing will never get so much as a whiff of the funds. Whenever I drive that mud-splattered heavy-duty pickup truck through the well-paved streets of Philadelphia, looking at those so-called elites in their bespoke suits and designer ties, I always remember that night. I remember the disgustingly thrown prawn. I remember Kendra's utterly despairing eyes. And I remember Julian's pathetic terror as the handcuffs clicked shut. I am still that contractor smelling of engine oil, still preferring to drive my pickup to the job site. The difference is that now no one, absolutely no one, dares to throw a prawn in front of me. In the crucial moment that prawn fell to the ground, some people choose to flip the entire table. Some choose to swallow their anger and shame. I chose to smile and send them directly to prison. If it had been you, how would you have handled that prawn? Thank you for taking the time to listen to this satisfying story of retribution. I wonder if you are currently moving bricks at a construction site, working late overtime in a sterile office building, or riding the subway home after a long shift. Wherever you may be, I sincerely hope that Garrett's perfect counterattack has brought you a brief moment of gratification. If you have also been looked down upon or used as a disposable tool, please remember this. People who truly do the work are never afraid of those liars who only pay lip service, because we know where the foundation is laid, and we always know exactly how to tear the building down. If this story has helped you vent some frustration or brought a knowing smile to your face, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. See you in the next story.